Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 3, Chapter 15. Britain Conquers the U-Boats. Depend upon it, sir, when a man knows he is to be hanged in a fortnight, it concentrates his mind wonderfully. By Dr. Johnson. It is commonly said that the German drive on Paris in 1914 and the unlimited U-boat warfare both nearly succeeded. But this expression requires analysis and also differentiation between the issues on land and sea. A partisan watching an evenly contested football match, an engineer watching a vehicle whose weight he does not know exactly, crossing a bridge whose strength he has never been able to measure, experiences no doubt similar sensations of anxiety or excitement. The processes, however, are different. A football match, like a great battle on land, is in a continual state of flux and change. But whether the vehicle will break down the bridge does not depend on chance. It depends on the weight of the vehicle and the strength of the bridge. When both these are unknown beforehand, anxiety is natural. But once it is known that the bridge will bear at least 10 tons and the vehicle at the most weighs no more than 8, all misgivings are proved to have been unfounded. To say that the vehicle nearly broke down the bridge is untrue. There was never any chance of it, whereas any one of a score of alternative accidents would have given the German army Paris in 1914. The seafaring resources of Great Britain were in fact and in the circumstances always superior to the U-boat attack. Moreover, that attack was inherently of a character so gradual that these superior resources could certainly obtain their full development. Nevertheless, the struggle between the British sailormen, royal and mercantile, for both played an equally indispensable part, and the German U-boats stands among the most heart-shaking episodes of history. And its declared result will for generations be regarded as a turning point in the destiny of nations. It was in scale and in stake the greatest conflict ever decided at sea. It was almost entirely a duel between Britain and Germany. Austrian submarines assisted the Germans. Allied navies, United States and Japanese destroyers, helped Great Britain to the best of their power. But 3/4 of the tonnage sunk was British, and 175 U-boats out of a total German war loss of 182 were destroyed by British agency. The shortcomings in the higher command of the British Navy, afloat and at home, which had led to Admiral de Robecque's failure to force the Dardanelles, to the abortive conclusion of Jutland, and to the neglect to carry the fighting into the German Bight, had given to the enemy during 1915 and 1916 the means of developing an entirely novel form of sea attack upon a scale the potential intensity of which no one could measure beforehand, and which, if successful, would be fatal. At first sight all seemed to favor the challengers. 200 U-boats, each possessing between 3 and 4 weeks' radius of action, each capable of sinking with torpedo, gunfire or bomb 4 or 5 vessels in a single day, beset the approaches to an island along which there passed in and out every week several thousand merchant vessels. The submarine, with only a periscope showing momentarily like a broomstick above the waves, could discharge its torpedo unseen. It could rise to the surface and fire its gun to sink, burn, or induce the surrender of a defenseless vessel, and disappear into the invisible depth of the vast waste of water without leaving a trace behind. Of all the tasks ever set to a navy, none could have appeared more baffling than that of sheltering this enormous traffic and groping deep below the surface of the sea for the deadly, elusive foe. It was in fact a game of blind man's buff in an unlimited space of 3 dimensions. Had the problem been surveyed in cold blood beforehand, it might well have seemed insoluble. But in the event, as the danger grew, so grew also the willpower of the threatened state, and the courage, endurance, and ingenuity of its servants. At the summit, through the authority of the Prime Minister, all misgivings were suppressed, all croakers silenced, and all doubters banished from executive responsibility. But strict inquiry was made into facts, and no official grimace passed long for argument. The qualities of audacity, initiative, and seamanship inbred in the sailors and young officers of the Navy found in this new warfare their highest opportunity. But without the unquenchable spirit of the merchant service, nothing would have availed. The foundation of all defense lay in the fact that merchant seamen, 3 or 4 times submarined, returned unfalteringly to the perilous seas, and even in the awful month, when 1 ship out of every 4 that left the United Kingdom never came home, no voyage was delayed for lack of resolute civilian volunteers. To realize the issues of this strange form of warfare, hitherto unknown to human experience, the reader must understand the general anatomy of the submarine. This delicate vessel is driven, when on the surface, by powerful oil engines, which in those days yielded speeds up to 16 or 17 knots. Submerged, she depended upon electric accumulators, which she could recharge by her oil engines when on the surface. These accumulators produced a maximum speed under water of about 8 knots, and would last about 1 hour at full and 20 at economical speed. In order to dive, a submarine does not give herself negative buoyancy, that is, make herself heavier than the water. She fills enough tanks to have about a ton of buoyancy in hand, and then, by depressing her horizontal rudders and going ahead on her electric motors, swims down to the desired depth. A submarine is strong enough to resist the ever-increasing water pressures down to about 250 feet below the surface. Beyond that depth there is increasing risk of leakage through the joints of her hull. Any serious penetration by salt water may liberate chlorine gas from the electric accumulators and choke the crew in tortures. Beyond a depth of 300 or 400 feet, a submarine would certainly be destroyed by the water pressure, and would swiftly sink bilged to the ocean floor. In deep water, therefore, a submarine could only remain submerged while in motion, and could only keep in motion as long as her accumulators lasted. When these were exhausted, she must come to the surface and float defenseless during several hours while they were being recharged. On the other hand, where the sea was not more than 250 feet deep, a submarine need not fear to give herself negative buoyancy. She could sink and sit on the bottom without using up her accumulators, as long as the air and oxygen tubes she carried enabled the crew to breathe. This allows her to remain below water for at least 48 hours, during which time she could also move perhaps 60 miles. The power to remain submerged for more than 20 hours was thus limited to the shallow seas. On the other hand, depths of less than 50 feet raised difficulties of another kind, which prevented submerged attacks. The prime weapon of all submarines was the torpedo, and as long as they fought warships, no other weapon was of any service. Thin-skinned submersible vessels could only engage in an artillery duel with armored surface ships at a fatal disparity in risk. The penetration of a U-boat's hull by a single shot deprived her of the power of diving, even if it did not sink her outright. But when the Germans decided to use their U-boats to attack merchant ships, another set of arguments arose. The merchant ships were so numerous that the torpedo was an unsuitable weapon for procuring decisive results. It was expensive, difficult and lengthy to manufacture. the supply could only gradually be broadened out, and only from 8 to 20 torpedoes could be carried in submarines according to their classes. As a large proportion of torpedoes missed their target for one fault or another, the destructive power of a U-boat against commerce during a single cruise was severely limited. Therefore, the first move of the Germans was to arm their U-boats with guns to attack merchant ships on the surface of the water, sinking them either by gunfire or, after surrender, by bombs placed on board. This method also enabled the U-boats to use their much superior surface speed and allowed them to discriminate between different classes of merchant ship and between enemy and neutral ships, to observe their own price law by visit and search, and finally to give time for the merchant crews, if they chose to surrender their vessel, to escape in open boats. The first British counter-move made on my responsibility in 1915 was to arm British merchantmen to the greatest possible extent with guns of sufficient power to deter the U-boat from surface attack. When this was achieved, the reduction of the assailant's speed and the limited torpedo supply increased the merchant ship's chance of escape proportionately. The argument was overwhelming. Unhappily, there were at first hardly any guns either for merchant ships or for the coastal patrols. We searched every quarter of the globe and all the recesses of the Admiralty for guns, no matter how obsolete or various in pattern. 100 coastal vessels by the spring of 1915 were provided with one 12-pounder gun apiece. The more important sea-going vessels were also armed. The scarcity was such that their guns had to be transferred from outward to inward-bound vessels at ports outside the submarine zone, so as to make them go further. Despite every effort made by my successor, Mr. Balfour, the supply of guns expanded slowly, and it was not until the autumn of 1916 that he was in a position to undertake the arming of the whole of the mercantile marine. Good progress had, however, been made before the submarine danger renewed itself in its gravest form. As the U-boats were forced by the progressive arming of the British mercantile marine to rely increasingly on underwater attacks, they encountered a new set of dangers. The submerged U-boat, with its defective vision, ran the greatest risk of mistaking neutral for British vessels and of drowning neutral crews, and thus of embroiling Germany with other great powers. We also resorted to the well-known ruse de guerre, of hoisting false colors in order further to baffle and confuse the enemy. Thus, from a very early stage, the U-boats were forced to choose between all the practical inconveniences and far-reaching diplomatic consequences of underwater attack with torpedo, or, on the other hand, of facing the disproportionate hazards of the gun duel on the surface. It was at this stage that we developed the stratagem of the Q-ship. A number of merchant vessels were specially equipped with torpedo tubes and with concealed guns firing from behind trapdoor bulwarks, and sent along the trade routes to offer themselves to the hostile submarines. When the U-boat, wishing to economize torpedoes, attacked the Q-ship by gunfire on the surface, a portion of the British crew took to the boats and, by every device, endeavored to entice the Germans to close quarters. Once the enemy was within decisive range, the white ensign was hoisted, the trapdoors fell, and a deadly fire by trained gunners was opened upon them. By these means, in 1915 and 1916, 11 U-boats were destroyed, and the rest, rendered far more nervous of attacking by gunfire, were thrown back more and more upon their torpedoes. By the end of 1917, this process was complete. The German submarine commanders would not face the unequal gunfire combat. The stratagem of the Q-ship was thus exhausted, and its last victim, U-88, perished in September 1917. The action between the Q-ship Dunraven and U-61 affords a vivid example of this strange form of war. On the morning of August 8, 1917, HMS Dunraven, disguised as an armed British merchant ship, was zigzagging towards the Bristol Channel, offering herself to submarine attack. At 10:58, a U-boat was sighted on the horizon 2 points before the starboard beam. The Dunraven continued to zigzag, and the U-boat, having approached submerged, broke surface at 11:43 on the starboard quarter and opened fire at about 5,000 yards. The Dunraven, playing her part as an armed merchantman, at once opened fire with her after gun, a 2.5-pounder. Her captain, Commander Gordon Campbell, ordered much smoke to be made from the funnels, but at the same time reduced speed to 7 knots with an occasional zigzag to give the enemy a chance of closing. This the enemy did, and by 12:25 was scarcely a half-mile away. Meanwhile, the Dunraven's unconcealed stern gun was incontinently firing short, and her commander made en clair signals to deceive the U-boat, such as "Submarine chasing and shelling me," "Submarine overtaking me, help, come quickly," "Submarine in position, am abandoning ship." At 12:40, when the U-boat shells were falling near, Commander Campbell made a cloud of steam to pretend boiler trouble, and gave the order, "Abandon ship." The Dunraven stopped, blowing off steam, and turned her broadside so that the enemy could see the panic on board. The crew tumbled into the boats, one of which purposely was left hanging by her aft davit. Thus encouraged, U-61 closed warily and continued firing. A shell went through the poop, exploding a depth charge and blowing up a lieutenant. 2 more shells crashed into the poop, setting it on fire. Clouds of dense smoke poured from the burning vessel, partially hiding from view the now swiftly approaching U-boat. The magazine and also the store of depth charges of the Dunraven being in the poop, it was obvious that an explosion must soon take place. The crew of the secret 4-inch gun immediately above the magazine stood to their post, waiting in grim anxiety for an opportunity which they were not destined to see. U-61 was now coming along nice from the port to starboard to pass 400 or 500 yards off. In a few minutes the attacker would be on the weather side and a perfect target. Commander Campbell, therefore, had the option of opening fire under difficult conditions or of waiting longer for a far better chance. He waited. At 12:58, when the U-boat was passing close astern of the Dunraven, 2 depth charges and some cordite exploded. The 4-inch gun and the gun's crew were blown into the air. The gun itself was hurled on to the well deck, and the crew fell in various places. 1 man in the water amid a shower of scattered 4-inch ammunition. The open fire buzzers of all the concealed guns were started by the explosion, and the gun on the afterbridge, the only one bearing, opened fire. Had this misfortune been delayed for 2 minutes more, 3 guns could have fired on U-61 at 400 yards range. U-61, warned from the size of the explosion that it had a Q-ship to deal with, dived instantly. Commander Campbell, realizing that he was now about to be torpedoed, ordered the doctor to remove all the wounded and lock them up in the cabins, so as not to spoil the next part. The fire hoses were turned on to the poop, which was a mass of flames. Although the deck was red-hot, the magazine itself had not yet exploded. Meanwhile, a warship had answered the Dunraven's en clair appeals for assistance. And fearing lest the action should be prematurely ended by her arrival, Commander Campbell signaled to her to keep away. At 1:20 a torpedo was seen approaching from the starboard side. It struck abaft the engine room. The ruse of abandoning ship had already been exhausted so far as an armed merchant ship was concerned. But the desperate condition of the Dunraven favored the hope that it might succeed in another form. There is a moment when even a warship must be abandoned. The order was therefore given: Q. Abandon ship. The 2 secret guns which had been exposed were left visible, and an additional party of men were ordered to escape by a raft and a damaged boat. U-61 was now in great doubt. Was the ship finally abandoned or not? For nearly an hour, showing only his periscope, the submarine circled round the heeling, burning ship at various ranges. During this period, boxes of cordite and 4-inch shells were continually exploding in the flames. At 2:30, U-61 broke surface directly astern, where no gun was bearing, and at a few hundred yards shelled the stricken ship. Nearly all the shells either hit the Dunraven or fell close to the boats, on which U-61 also fired with a Maxim. 2 shells burst on the bridge with serious effects. All this time Commander Campbell still waited for a favorable chance. At 2:50, U-61 ceased shelling, submerged and steamed past the Dunraven's port side at about 150 yards distance. Only a small part of the periscope was showing, but this revealed both depth and position. The long-awaited moment had now come. The Dunraven was armed not only with guns but with underwater torpedo tubes. Unfortunately, she was heeling over so far that accurate aiming was spoiled. At 2:55, Commander Campbell fired a torpedo. The bubbles passed just ahead of the periscope, and the U-boat, unaware that destruction had missed her by a few inches, came slowly round on to the starboard side. This gave the Dunraven a second chance, and at 3:20 another torpedo was fired. Again the bubbles passed close to the periscope, and the deadly weapon can only have missed its mark by the narrowest margin. This time U-61 saw the peril and dived deep. Commander Campbell, having exhausted every device and with his ship in a sinking condition, signaled for assistance. Men of war, headed by the United States destroyer Nomah, arrived from all quarters. The U-boat, whose periscope had again been seen, was hunted, and the Dunraven, after her crew had been rescued, foundered in the great approach route she had so faithfully defended. For his tireless perseverance in this action, Commander Campbell received the Victoria Cross. By all these maneuvers and pressures, the Germans were confronted during 1916 with the dilemma either of losing a great many U-boats in gun duels with Q-ship ambuscades, or of resorting almost entirely to the torpedo with a vastly increased risk of offending neutrals. This complicated and nicely balanced discussion produced great stresses and cross-purposes between the German naval and civil authorities. The naval staff, headed by Tirpitz and Scheer, demanded that the authorities should sink at sight all vessels in the war zone. The Emperor and the Chancellor, in their fear of offending neutrals, insisted that the custom of visit and search should be complied with in the case of unarmed ships. But, protested the naval staff, which were the unarmed ships, and what would happen to the U-boat while she was making her inquiries? They declared, moreover, that unrestricted warfare would increase the sinkings to such an extent that Britain would be forced within 6 months to sue for peace. The relative vulnerability of armed and unarmed ships can be judged from the following summary of U-boat attacks on British vessels between January 1, 1916 and January 25, 1917. Of defensively armed ships, 310 were attacked. Of unarmed ships, 302 were attacked. Defensively armed ships sunk by torpedoes without warning, 62. Unarmed ships, 30. Defensively armed ships sunk by gunfire or bombs, 12. Unarmed ships, 205. Defensively armed ships escaped, 236. unarmed ships 67. Defensively armed ships percentage escaped 76, unarmed ships 22. These figures are illuminating and conclusive. They show that the U-boat was scarcely ever willing to face the gun duel with an armed vessel, and in consequence that with equal numbers of ships attacked, the armed ships had nearly 4 times the unarmed ships' chance of escape. So much for the first great measure of defense. The principal means of attacking submarines underwater was by dropping overboard charges which exploded at a certain depth. The shock of these explosions seriously jarred the submarine, and, if near enough, deranged her mechanism or opened her joints. These depth charges were our earliest anti-submarine device. Gradually the methods of dropping them improved, and their size and number were multiplied many times. The arch-enemy of the submarine was the destroyer. She had the fastest speed, the greatest number of depth charges, and was herself cheaper than the quarry she hunted. When the periscope of a U-boat was seen in deep water, all the available destroyers and motor launches and other fast small craft spread in an organized network over the surface so as to keep her down and force her to exhaust her accumulators. And alike in deep water or in shallow, the slightest indication of her whereabouts, an air bubble, an oil stain on the surface, drew the dreaded depth charges in a searching shower. As the struggle progressed, the skill and methods of the hunting vessel perpetually improved. Wonderful instruments were devised for detecting the beat of a submarine propeller, and with this and other indications, a U-boat was sometimes pursued to death after an intermittent but unrelenting chase of more than 36 hours, during which the U-boat had perhaps replenished her electric batteries on the surface, unseen, 2 or 3 times. The second anti-submarine weapon was the thin wire net hung in long strips across straits or narrow channels. These nets, buoyed by the surface with glass balls, were intended to foul the propeller of the U-boat and to cling about the hull. A U-boat thus enveloped, even if her motive power was not affected, would unconsciously be trailing a fatal telltale buoy about upon the surface, thus guiding her pursuers. To these light nets there were added in particular channels elaborately devised necklaces of mines joined with nets and watched by large numbers of trawlers with destroyers at ready call. Collision was another danger for the slow-moving, half-blind creature, and the ram of battleship, cruiser, destroyer, or merchant ship on frequent occasions exacted the final forfeit. Lastly, submarines stalked one another, and a U-boat, while attacking a merchant ship or recharging its batteries upon the surface, was on more than one occasion blown to pieces by the torpedo of a submerged pursuer of whose approach she was unconscious. The brutal features inseparable from the submarine attack on merchant vessels and the miserable fate which so often overtook the passengers and civilian crew inspired this warfare with exceptional fierceness. The attack upon warships, however grievous in loss of life, was considered fair war by the Royal Navy. The sinking of merchant vessels or neutral ships or hospital ships seemed to be a barbarous, treacherous, and piratical act deserving every conceivable means of extermination. When we consider that nearly 13,000 British lives were destroyed by the German U-boats, and that many were civilians, and the cruel and shocking incidents, to some extent inevitable, which characterized this warfare, and when we remember further the awful character of the stakes, the fact that several hundred German officers and men were rescued from the sea or allowed to surrender after scuttling their vessels is a tribute to the restraint of the deeply injured conqueror. The Germans had originally decided to begin unrestricted submarine war on April 1, 1916. The threat of the United States to break off relations after the attack on the Sussex led at the end of the month to the permission being withdrawn. When Admiral Scheer, an ardent advocate of unrestricted warfare, received this order, he intemperately recalled the High Sea Fleet U-boats, refusing to permit them to work on the basis of visit and search. From May to October, therefore, the campaign was practically confined to the Mediterranean and to the mine layers of the Flanders flotilla. The relief thus afforded to Great Britain in northern waters was, however, both fleeting and illusory. The Mediterranean U-boats, working in accordance with German prize procedure, succeeded in sinking a large number of ships, and the German naval staff on October 6 ordered Scheer to resume restricted warfare with the North Sea flotillas. In the interval, the number of U-boats available for active service had risen from 47 in March to 93 in November. The sinkings consequently increased rapidly when operations were resumed. The average monthly loss for the period April to September had been 131,000 tons. That from November to February rose to 276,000 tons. By the end of 1916, it was evident that the development of anti-submarine measures had not kept pace with the increasing intensity of the attack. The defensive measures instituted during 1915 had increased the number of armed merchantmen and auxiliary patrol vessels, but the problem of actually attacking and destroying U-boats was still in a rudimentary stage. On February 1, the unrestricted attack began in full vigor, and the numbers of the U-boats continually increased. The losses of British, Allied and neutral vessels increased from 181 in January to 259 in February, 325 in March, and 423 in April. The corresponding figures in gross tonnage being 298,000 in January, 468,000 in February, 500,000 in March, and 849,000 in April. We now know that the German naval staff estimated that British shipping could be reduced at a rate of 600,000 tons a month, and that in 5 months at this rate Britain would be forced to her knees. In April alone, the total world tonnage lost reached the appalling figure of 849,000 tons. The average monthly loss of British shipping during April, May and June from U-boats amounted to 409,300 tons, corresponding to a rate of nearly 5 million tons a year. By the end of May, apart from vessels employed on naval and military services or essential trade in distant waters and undergoing repairs, there was less than 6 million tons of shipping available for all the supplies and trade with the United Kingdom. If losses continued at this rate and were equally divided among the services exposed to attack, the tonnage available for trade at the beginning of 1918 would be reduced to under 5 million tons. That is to say, an amount almost exactly equal to the gross sinkings in 1917. It seems that time, hitherto counted as an incorruptible ally, was about to change sides. Nor did the entry of the United States into the war shed any beam of hope on these dark waters. The longed-for American resources required a vast array of British tonnage to transport them to the front. The patrol system in the approaches to the English Channel and south of Ireland had completely broken down. Not only were the limited numbers of the patrol vessels unable to protect the shipping, but their mere presence assisted the submarines to find the traffic routes. In April, the great approach route to the southwest of Ireland was becoming a veritable cemetery of British shipping, in which large vessels were sunk regularly day by day about 200 miles from land. During this month, it was calculated that 1 in 4 merchant ships leaving the United Kingdom never returned. The U-boat was rapidly undermining not only the life of the British islands, but the foundations of the Allies' strength, and the danger of their collapse in 1918 began to loom black and imminent. The stern pressure of events reacted upon Admiralty organization. In May, the naval staff was given an appropriate position on the board by the merging of the office of First Sea Lord and Chief of Staff, while the addition of a deputy and assistant who could each act with board authority accelerated business and relieved the Chief of Staff of a mass of work. The Operations Division, hitherto troubled, like Martha, over many things, had not been able to think far enough ahead. In May, a small planning section was instituted, charged with a study of policy and preparation of plans, and this was later in the year expanded into a separate division. Younger officers were called to the Admiralty and more responsibility was given to them. Without this reorganization of the staff, the measures that defeated the U-boat, even if conceived, could not have been executed. These measures took a threefold form. First, the preparation and launching of extensive mining plans. Secondly, the further development of research and supply in the technical fields of mines, depth charges, and hydrophones. And thirdly, the decisive step, the institution of a convoy system which involved the escort and control of all merchant shipping. I had instituted the convoy system for troop ships crossing the oceans at the beginning of the war. Then the attack by faster German light cruisers was the danger. The guns of an obsolete battleship or heavy cruiser could certainly drive away any hostile raiders then loose upon the surface of the seas. We had also from the beginning used destroyer escorts to convoy troop ships in and out through the submarine zone. In no case did any mishap occur. It did not, however, seem reasonable to expect similar results from the convoy system in the case of attack by submarines upon merchant ships. On the contrary, it seemed obvious that hostile submarines would work more damage in the midst of a crowd of merchantmen than against isolated vessels. And it was further evident that the escorting warships would themselves be among the targets of the enemy torpedoes. The U-boat attacks on trade in 1915 and the early part of 1916 seemed to have been confined within tolerable limits by the numbers of merchant vessels at sea, by the variety of their routes and ports, by the uncertainty of their times of arrival, and above all, by the size of the sea. The system of watching and patrolling in the greatest strength possible, the confluences of trade had worked well against the German raiding cruisers, and for the first 2 years of the war the Admiralty relied upon it against the U-boats without serious misadventure. When under pressure of ever-increasing losses the remedy of convoys was again advocated by the younger officers of the Admiralty War Staff, it encountered opposition from practically every quarter. Every squadron and every naval base was clamant for destroyers, and convoy meant taking from them even those that they had. There would be delays due to assembling, there must be reduction in speed of the faster vessels, and congestion of ships in port. The scale and difficulties of the task were exaggerated, and it was argued that the larger the number of ships in company, the greater the risk from submarines. This convincing logic could only be refuted by the proof of facts. In January 1917, the official Admiralty opinion was expressed as follows. A system of several ships sailing in company as a convoy is not recommended in any area where submarine attack is a possibility. It is evident that the larger the number of ships forming a convoy, the greater the chance of a submarine being able to attack successfully, and the greater the difficulty of the escort in preventing such an attack. The French and United States naval authorities were also opposed to the convoy system, and at a conference held in February 1917, representative masters of merchant ships took the same view. Now let us see what was overlooked in this high, keen, and earnest consensus. The size of the sea is so vast that the difference between the size of a convoy and the size of a single ship shrinks in comparison almost to insignificance. There was in fact very nearly as good a chance of a convoy of 40 ships in close order slipping unperceived between the patrolling U-boats as there was for a single ship, and each time this happened, 40 ships escaped instead of one. Here then was the key to the success of the convoy system against U-boats. The concentration of ships greatly reduced the number of targets in a given area and thus made it more difficult for the submarine to locate their prey. Moreover, the convoys were easily controlled and could be quickly deflected by wireless from areas known to be dangerous at any given moment. Finally, the destroyer, instead of being dissipated on patrol over wide areas, were concentrated at the point of the hostile attack, and opportunities of offensive action frequently arose. 13 U-boats were actually destroyed while endeavoring to molest convoys. This fear of instant retaliation from convoy escorts had a demoralizing effect upon the enemy, and consequently U-boat attacks were not always pressed home. Most of this was still unproved in the early days of 1917. There stood only the fact that troopship convoys had always been escorted through the submarine zones during 1915 and 1916 and had enjoyed complete immunity from attack. The highest professional opinion remained opposed to convoy as a defense against U-boats. And personally I rested under that impression. I had no official position at that time, but I had confidential relations with ministers and was informed both upon the discussion and the facts. I therefore wrote in March for the First Lord of the Admiralty, Sir Edward Carson, the following note. It was intended to offer an alternative means of gaining the advantages claimed by its advocates for the convoy system without running counter to the solid objections of the naval authorities. I print it because it throws a contemporary light upon the problem and because, although the method proposed was rejected in favor of a simpler and more practical plan, the reasonings are sound. March 1917. It is assumed for the purposes of this argument that the Germans use about 50 submarines at a time in 3 reliefs, that every submarine remains out about a month and takes, except in the case of the Seebrugge boats, from 2 to 3 days to get to its beat. The number of enemy submarines actually on the watch is not large enough to allow of any great concentration. They must be widely dispersed to cover the whole extended approaches to these islands. There cannot be any large number in any one station. The amount of damage which a submarine can do is limited by its store of torpedoes and also by the hours of the day. Tackling even a single ship involves a considerable time. What a submarine wants in order to make its best back is a steady trickle of shipping day after day, more or less evenly dispersed along all the routes approaching these islands. It is arguable that a greater concentration both of shipping and of the means of protection, now here, now there, along particular routes and at particular times, would sensibly reduce the proportion of losses. The measures suggested are as follows. Tell all ships which have wireless who are approaching our shores and expect to enter the area of submarine activity by nightfall, say Monday night, to steam back on their course for 36 hours and then to resume their voyage. Tell all ships who would similarly arrive on Tuesday night to steam back on their course for 24 hours. And all ships that would similarly arrive on Wednesday night to steam back on their course for 12 hours, and then, in all cases, resume their voyage. The result of this would be to create 4 blank days and to quadruple the volume of shipping arriving in the danger zone on the 4th day. For 3 days, therefore, the German submarines would be useless and would find no prey. On the 4th day, they would be confronted with a crowd of shipping out of which it is possible, owing to their limited numbers, that they could not take a proportionate toll. It is clear that you could afford to lose 4 times as much shipping on the 4th day as on any one of the 4 days without being worse off. If the number of submarines remains few and constant, their activity being in many respects a limited factor, while the volume of traffic is quadrupled, there is very fair prospect of the proportion of losses not increasing in anything like the same ratio as the proportion of shipping. One knows that if you want a big bag of pheasants, you beat them out of the cover in 2s and 3s. Whereas if it is intended to shoot the cover over again, the whole lot should be driven out as quickly as possible in the largest numbers. If rabbits run across a ride past a limited number of guns, their best chance is to run unexpectedly and all at once. It is quite possible that these simple analogies have a wider application. There is no reason to believe that losses are proportionate to the volume of traffic. The variations from day to day effectively prove this. There is every reason to believe that losses are limited by increased protection. The ships fitted with wireless are the most important and the largest. They are the ones which raise the tonnage totals. The experiment applied to them alone, as it necessarily must be, would be well worthwhile attempting. But if it were successful, the universal adoption of wireless on our merchant service would follow as a matter of course. The intermittence and uncertainty which may be imparted to the movements of our shipping by the regulation of time can be supplemented by the variation of routes. After one accumulation of shipping has been released upon, say, the Bristol Channel, the next might be directed on Liverpool or the Clyde, or the available protection being meanwhile concentrated so far as possible upon the route about to be used. It fell to Sir Edward Carson's lot during his tenure as First Lord to face the most anxious and trying period of the naval war. During those 8 months, the U-boat sinkings of merchantmen reached their terrible climax. It was under his administration that the peak was surmounted and most of the important decisions of principle were taken by which the peril was ultimately overcome. The trial of the convoy system was urged upon the naval authorities by the Cabinet, and in this the Prime Minister took a decisive part. At the end of April 1917, the director of the Anti-Submarine Division definitely advocated the introduction of convoys, and the first one left Gibraltar on May 10. It was entirely successful, and regular convoys commenced from the United States on June 4. Instructions were issued on June 22 to extend the system to Canadian ports, and on July 31 similar orders were issued for the South Atlantic trade. The entry of the United States facilitated convoys by opening her harbors as ports of assembly and by the precious aid of a number of her destroyers for escort work. More than a quarter of the whole of the escorts across the Atlantic were provided by American destroyers, and the comradeship of this hard service forms an ineffaceable tradition for the two navies. The convoy organization will forever stand as a monument to the constancy and courage of the Royal Navy and Mercantile Marine. No credit is too high for the officers and men who, without previous training, navigated these fleets of 40 or 50 ships in close formation through all the winds that blew. No service ever carried out by the Navy was of greater value to the state than that of the escort vessels. Those who have served in small ships will realize the skill, faithfulness, and hardihood required to carry out this duty day after day, month after month, in wild weather and wintry seas, without breakdown or failure. The control and arrangements of the Admiralty and the Ministry of Shipping became more thorough and perfect with every week that passed. The convoy system was at first confined to homeward-bound vessels. The percentage of sinkings in the outward sailings at once began to rise. In August 1917, convoy was extended to outward-bound vessels. The diagram on page 266 and 67 reveals at a glance the triumph of the convoy. By the end of October 1917, 99 homeward convoys, comprising of 1,500 steamers of a deadweight capacity of 10,656,000 tons, had been brought in, with the loss of only 10 ships torpedoed while actually in convoy, and of 14 which had become separated. While convoy was vastly improving the protection of trade, all methods of attacking the U-boats were progressively developed, and the rate of destruction steadily rose. In April 1917, British submarine flotillas were based upon Scapa Flow, Lough Swilly on the north, and Killybegs on the west coast of Ireland, and began to lie in wait for U-boats passing northabout to attack the great trade route. At the same time, in the southern part of the North Sea, the small British C-class submarines were released from harbour defence for the same duties. This method, by which submarine vessels preyed on each other, yielded substantial results. 7 U-boats were destroyed by it in 1917 and 6 in 1918. The threat of submarine attack also forced the U-boats to submerge much more frequently and for longer periods on their passage, with consequent delays in reaching their beats. The mine, however, proved to be the most effective killing weapon. The Admiralty, before the war, had not expected the mine to play an important part. In a war on the surface of the sea, the weaker navy would no doubt use such a weapon to hamper the movements of its superior antagonist. But for the stronger fleet, the fewer minefields, the better. These conclusions, which at the time were not ill-founded, were upset by the changes for which the prolongation of the war gave time. At the outset, the British mines were few and inefficient. It was even stated in a German order that British mines generally do not explode. This was an exaggeration, but we were certainly at fault in the matter. At the end of April 1916, an attempt was made by the Dover force under Admiral Sir Reginald Bacon to blockade the Flanders U-boats by a long and extensive barrage off the Belgian coast. This was completed by May 7. It consisted of 18 miles of moored mines and nets guarded from May to October by day patrols. UB-13 was destroyed by one of its mines the day after the barrage was laid, and an immediate diminution of U-boat activity in the North Sea and the Channel followed. This was not unnaturally attributed to the new barrage and gave the Dover command an exaggerated idea of its value. We now know that it was to Admiral Scheer's impulsive recall of the High Sea Fleet U-boat flotillas, and not to the Dover barrage, that the marked improvement of these months was due. For only one U-boat was destroyed by its mines, nor did it seriously impede their movements in and out. Efforts to improve the quality of the British mines had been unceasing since the beginning of the war. It was not until the autumn of 1917 that the new horned mines became available in large quantities. The improvement of the new type upon the old cannot be better measured than by the fact that out of 41 U-boats destroyed by mines, only 5 were prior to September 1917. No less than 15,700 mines were laid in the Heligoland Bight during 1917, and 21,000 more in 1918, mainly by the 20th Destroyer Flotilla working from the Humber. This attempt to block in the U-boats developed into a protracted struggle between British mine layers and German minesweepers. The enemy was forced to escort the U-boats both on their inward and outward journey with a whole array of minesweepers, of specially constructed ships with concrete-filled bows called barrier breakers, and torpedo boats. These escorts had to be protected, and from 1917 onwards, the main occupation of the High Sea Fleet was the support of its sweeping forces working far afield on the submarine routes. As time went on, the difficulties of egress and ingress increased. The ways, or swept channels, in the Bight were frequently closed, and in October 1917, homeward-bound submarines began to be sent round by the Kattegat. Early in 1918, about 1,400 deep mines were laid in the Kattegat, but could not be patrolled. The intensive mining of the Bight failed to achieve success because of the difficulties of attacking the German sweeping craft and the lack of destroyers for the patrol of the Kattegat. The effort, however, destroyed several U-boats and increased their time of passage to and from the trade routes. During 1917, the failure of the 1916 barrage across the Dover Straits had been total. From February to November, U-boats continued to pass through it at the rate of about 24 a month. The Dover Passage saved a small Flanders U-boat nearly 8 days on its 14 days cruise, and a larger boat from the Bight 6 days out of 25. It was decided to make a fresh attempt with all the improved appliances now at hand. On November 21, a new deep minefield was laid between the Varne and Grisnez. When no fewer than 21 U-boats passed through this in the first fortnight, a sharp controversy arose at the Admiralty. Some authorities supported the contentions of the Dover Command that the barrage was largely successful and that additional patrolling was impracticable. Others held that an intensive patrol and the use of searchlights and hares at night to make the U-boats dive into the mines would achieve great results. About this time, and partly in connection with this discussion, Sir John Jellicoe was replaced as First Sea Lord by Admiral Wemyss, and Admiral Bacon was succeeded in the Dover Command by Admiral Keyes. Keyes revolutionized the situation. He redoubled the patrols, and by night the barrage from end to end became as bright as Piccadilly. The German destroyers from Ostend and Seebrugge attempted to break down the patrols by sudden raids. They were repulsed in fierce night actions, and the watch maintained with ever-increasing efficiency. 9 U-boats perished in the Dover area between January and May 1918, and 4 more by September. As early as February, the Bight boats ceased to use the straits, and by April the Flanders boats had largely abandoned it. In September only 2 boats passed through, one of which was destroyed on its return. The famous story of the blocking of Seebrugge on St. George's Day by Admiral Keyes and the Dover force cannot be repeated here. It may well rank as the finest feat of arms in the Great War, and certainly as an episode unsurpassed in the history of the Royal Navy. The harbour was completely blocked for about 3 weeks and was dangerous to U-boats for a period of 2 months. Although the Germans, by strenuous efforts, partially cleared the entrance after some weeks for U-boats, no operations of any importance were ever again carried out by the Flanders destroyers. The results of Admiral Keyes' command at Dover reduced the Allied losses in the English Channel from about 20 to 6 a month, and the minefields laid by the Flanders boats fall from 33 a month in 1917 to 6 a month in 1918. These results, which constitute a recognizable part of the general victory, were achieved notwithstanding the fact that the numbers of U-boats in commission were maintained by new building at about 200. The attempts to mine in the Helgoland Bight had been frustrated by the German sweeping operations, closely supported by the High Sea Fleet. It was thought that a more distant barrage under the direct watch and ward of the Grand Fleet might succeed. In 1918, an ambitious scheme for establishing a line of guarded minefields across the 180 miles of water between Norway and the Orkney Islands was developed by the British and American navies. Enormous quantities of materials, regardless of cost or diversion of effort, were employed upon this supreme manifestation of defensive warfare. The large center section was laid entirely by Americans, the Orkney section by the British and the Norway section by the two navies in combination. The Americans used a special type of mine with antenna that exploded the charge on coming into contact with the metal hull. They laid no less than 57,000 mines, a large number of which exploded prematurely shortly after being laid. The British contribution was about 13,000 mines, but some of these were not laid deep enough for surface craft to pass over and had in consequence to be swept up. The efficiency of this enormous material effort cannot be judged, for the minefield was barely completed when the armistice was signed. It is known, however, that 2 U-boats were damaged on the center section, and 4 may possibly have been destroyed on the Orkney section. The ever-increasing efficiency of the anti-submarine organization during 1918 also mastered the mine-laying tactics of the U-boats. Closer cooperation between the British intelligence and minesweeping divisions, the rapid distribution of news, the firmer control of shipping and the use of the otter all played their part. Footnote: the otter is a species of submerged wire cutter towed on both bows for cutting the mooring ropes of mines. End of footnote. 123 British merchant ships had been sunk by German mines in 1917. In 1918, this number was reduced to 10. All other anti-submarine devices were developed with ceaseless ingenuity. Aircraft, hydrophones, and special types of mines levied an increasing toll upon the U-boats. During 1918, high hopes were based on systematic hunting tactics, and trawler flotillas equipped with ingenious listening devices were assembled in the northern area for this purpose. Several contacts were made, but the U-boats escaped by going dead slow so that their movements could not be detected by the instruments, and we could not provide enough destroyers over such wide areas to exhaust their accumulators. The final phase of the U-boat war saw the roles of the combatants reversed. It was the U-boat and not the merchant ship that was hunted. The experiences of UB 110 on her first cruise may serve as an example. She sailed from Zeebrugge on July 5, 1918. Even before she had joined the Flanders flotilla, she had been attacked by 2 aeroplanes. Every day from July 7 onwards, her log records the dropping of depth charges around her in every increasing numbers until the 18th, when 26 exploded close at hand. She was only able to fire 2 torpedoes during the cruise. The first one damaged an oil ship, but she could not see the result of the second owing to an immediate and violent counterattack by destroyers. On the 19th, when attempting to attack a convoy, her diving rudders were damaged by a depth charge dropped from a motor launch, and while endeavoring to submerge, she was rammed and sunk by a destroyer. In these latter days, a Flanders U-boat could hope for only 6 voyages before meeting its dark doom. The unceasing presentiment of a sudden and frightful death beyond human sight or succor, the shuddering concussions of the depth charges, the continual attacks of escort vessels, the fear of annihilation at any moment from mines, the repeated hairbreadth escapes, produced a state of nervous tension in the U-boat crews. Their original high morale declined rapidly during 1918 under an intolerable strain. The surrender of more than 1 undamaged submarine and numerous cases of boats putting back for small repairs a few days after leaving harbor showed that even in its valiant age the limits of human endurance had been reached. The various stages of the U-boat war and its strange conditions have now been examined. No sooner had the German war leaders taken their irrevocable decision to begin the unlimited attack on commerce than the Russian Revolution, by rendering their situation less desperate, removed the principal impulsion. No sooner had the unlimited U-boat warfare forced the United States into the field against Germany than the effectiveness of the U-boats began to decline. The month that saw President Wilson jingling among his cavalrymen to the Senate to cast the life energy of a nation of 120 millions into the adverse scales marked also the zenith of the U-boat attack. Never again did Germany equal the April sinkings. Many months of grievous losses and haunting anxiety lay before the islanders and their allies, and immense diversions, some needless, of strained resources hampered their military effort. But with every month the sense of increasing mastery grew stronger. At one time the plotted curves of sinkings and replacements, which our graphs revealed, seemed a veritable writing on the wall. But the awful characters faded steadily. The autumn of 1917, which was to have seen the fulfillment of German dreams, came, passed, and left us safer. By the end of the year it was certain we should not succumb. It was certain, moreover, that the war could be carried on until the power of the United States could, if necessary, be fully exerted on the battlefield of Europe. By the middle of 1918, the submarine campaign had been definitely defeated. And though new U-boats replaced those destroyed, every month added to their perils, to the restriction of their depredations, and to the demoralization of their crews. The weapon purchased so dearly by the German war leaders had first been blunted and then broken in their hands. It remained for them only to pay the price, and meet the fury of the world in arms. But from this they did not shrink.